Hey everybody, I'm Sam Gross from electricbikereport.com, and this is the Honbike HF01. It's a very unique and in some ways a little bit bizarre electric folding bike that's designed to solve several issues around durability of bicycle-specific components. It's taken several lessons from the automotive and motorcycle industry and applied them to the e-bike. But how do these components work in the real world? We're going to put this bike to the test to find out. As e-bikes have been increasingly viewed as an e-mobility solution over something like a fun toy, calls have been growing stronger for the bike industry to fix several issues that have long plagued commuters and casual riders alike. Wear parts. I'm talking about things like bicycle chains, sprockets, rear cassettes, derailleur cables, things that are impermanent fixtures of a bicycle that, due to how they intermesh together, wear and degrade over time. I'm sure many of you out there have an old bicycle sitting in the corner of a garage that can't be used anymore. Maybe the shifting has gone out of whack because the derailleur cable has stretched or broken. Maybe the chain is so dirty and dry that it won't wrap around the cassettes or the cogs anymore. Whatever that reason is, it is undeniable that a solution is needed for those of us that aren't looking to aggressively maintain a bicycle as it gets used. The automotive and motorcycle industries have long ago found solutions for these ideas, and then now some of these ideas have begun trickling into the e-bike industry. The Honbike HF01 is one such example of this. Designed by a team that allegedly heralds from Honda's motorcycle division, the Honbike has found several solutions for some of the most problematic wear parts of a bicycle. The centerpiece of all of this is its drive shaft. So instead of a traditional chain and sprocket-driven drivetrain, the Honbike uses a drive shaft, which, according to the company, is allegedly good for 40,000 kilometers of maintenance-free riding, which is absurdly long and is absolutely longer than this bike will probably last. Honbike has additionally fit their electric folder with a set of cast magnesium one-piece wheels, which obviously lack the traditional spokes, hubs, nipples, and rims that you'd typically get out of a complete bicycle wheel. And by doing that, they've got a wheel that in theory will never go out of true. You can't knock it out of true, you can't dent it out of true, it's just going to stay as one solid piece. Built into that front magnesium wheel is a 250 watt front hub motor. Housed inside the frame, you've got a 36 volt, 6 amp hour or 216 watt hour battery that's integrated into this little kind of pouch underneath the top tube. It's removable, which is very important. But enough of me blabbering about the specs of the bike. Let's see how it performs in the real world. Obviously, one of the most interesting design features of the Honbike HF01 are its reversed brake levers. So the bicycle brake lever or the motorcycle brake lever or really any handlebarred vehicle's brake lever typically pivots from the inside of your hands. So right here on the inside of your hand, you pull the brakes in, the levers point outwards from the handlebars. But on the Honbike, they've changed that design. They've reversed it so the pivot point for the brakes are actually on the outside of your handlebars. I personally didn't notice any sort of improvement or detriment to the bike's ride quality or how the brakes performed. The levers felt normal for mechanical disc brakes when you pulled them in. I even kind of liked the little bit of extra platform that it gave on the outside of the handlebars. I typically ride with my hands very wide, so it was kind of nice to be able to rest my hands there. But aside from that little bit of comfort, I didn't notice too much difference about these. Now, those brake levers are hooked up to a set of mechanical disc brakes front and rear, and to get an idea of how those brakes perform in the real world, we put this bike through a brake test where we normally would bring the bike up to 20 miles an hour, slam on the brakes as hard as possible 5 times and get an average stopping distance. Now, the issue with the Honbike is it only goes up to 15.5 miles an hour. You can't pedal it faster than that because you have the single speed drive shaft. You can't just make it go 20 miles an hour. So we're not going to be able to compare this bike's brake test to any of the other bikes that we've reviewed, but we put the bike through the brake test anyway, just to get an idea of how it performed on its own. The Honbike HF01 performed fairly nicely in our braking test, coming to a stop on average in 11 feet and 7 inches. Now, we can't compare that against the performance of all of the other e-bikes we've put through our brake test because this bike couldn't go 20 miles an hour, so it wouldn't be a fair fight to the ones that did. But I can talk a little bit about how the bike felt under that really hard stopping. And it felt mostly good. I never felt like I was going out of control. These tires hooked up well. They controlled the skid very well. One thing I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in the handling section is this bike has a little bit of a wallowy feel. Something that's unique about it, it has a single-sided fork, a single-sided swing arm in the back end, and then these magnesium wheels. And magnesium, it is worth noting, is a relatively soft metal. It just feels wallowy. You get a little bit of flex side to side, and I could feel that while I was braking really, really hard. Is it something that seemed to affect performance? No. The bike stayed upright. I stayed safe the whole time. I felt very much in control. Some of these really hard stopping tests, I don't know if the average person could really replicate it, but this one you can. It's very safe. It stops nicely. These mechanical disc brakes work well. The Honbike is built around a 36 volt, 6 amp hour or 216 watt hour battery that's integrated into the frame right above the bottom bracket there. And now that's a nice placement for a battery. Obviously a big hunk of lithium like that is probably going to be the most heavy component of a bike. So you want it right there situated, centered, right above the bottom bracket, low to the ground, so you have a nice neutral center of gravity. Now, how does this battery perform in the real world? How long can you actually ride it? It's powering a 250 watt front hub motor, so it is notably small. 216 watt hours is not very big. One of the benefits of that is it helps keep the weight down. Again, this thing weighs about 46 pounds, so it's a fairly light e-bike. But when you're powering a 250 watt front hub motor, that 216 watt hour battery is a little bit on the small side. I like to see typically a 1-to-1 ratio between the battery's watt hour and the motor's wattage. The reason for that is watt hour is an indicator of how long a battery can power a motor at full blast for 1 hour continuously before it dies. So this battery, if you were to take it and put it into a lab, it could power a 216 watt front hub motor, or hub motor in general, for 1 continuous hour before it died. So with this 250 watt front hub motor, you're gonna get a little bit less of an hour worth of battery charge out of running this bike full blast. Obviously that's a lab controlled setting, not super applicable to the real world, but it is a good rule of thumb when you're thinking about batteries and motors. We did test this bike in the real world. We did 2 range tests on it, the first in PAS2 and the second in PAS5. And what we found was in PAS2, our test rider was able to go 20.8 miles before the bike finally died. And then in PAS5, we were able to go 14.5 miles. So pretty solid range. And again, in the context of this bike, how it's intended to be used, it's a small electric folding bike. You're probably not going to be riding it for super long durations. You're going to be looking to go from point A to point B and then back, probably in a small urban setting. You're not going to be covering a lot of miles all at once. I would say that those 2 ranges are probably good enough for whatever you're going to be doing. Honbike has fitted the HF01 with a 250 watt front hub motor. Now, this front hub motor is a class 1 unit, meaning there's no throttle, but it does have 5 levels of pedal assistance, all of which is capped at 15.5 miles an hour. So this is a relatively modestly powerful and modestly fast electric folding bike. Again, you're going to be using this mostly, or I think the average person is going to be using this mostly in a little bit more of a crowded urban environment where speed isn't so much of a factor as it is just the ease of getting around. Now, something that's really cool about this bike, even beyond the drive shaft, beyond the magnesium wheels, is the fact that it uses a trifecta of sensors to actually tell the motor what to do. So we always put our electric bikes through our circuit test where we take a sample of how each of the 5 pedal assist levels perform, and we did that on this bike. What we're looking for is just a nice and consistent jump in speed between each pedal assist level. What this does is it gives the rider quite a bit of control over how much power the motor is giving them and how much power they're having to put out through their legs. And aside from PAS1, which didn't really give much assistance at all, we found really nice and even increments of increased power and speed between all of the pedal assist levels. Now, one final note to think about this bike, which is important considering it's a single speed. This is something that's important to think about anytime you're considering a single speed e-bike. Is this bike is a little bit spinny when you get going quickly. At 15.5 miles an hour, I'm really just kind of soft pedaling it along. I'm not able to put, at least comfortably, really much effort into that rear wheel to help the motor out. You don't have the gear ratio to do it. And because you don't have the gears to change, that's not something you can fix. But it is kind of nice, you know, it gives you a smaller gear to climb uphill, but just something to keep in mind when you are cruising along at its max motor assisted speed of 15.5 miles an hour. In pursuit of fixing the rather large issue of wear parts on electric bicycles, I think the Honbike's designers may have gotten a little carried away and started fixing problems that didn't necessarily need fixing. And I'm talking mostly about that weird golf club shaped saddle that's sticking out of the seat post. Now, saddles are obviously a very personal thing. No two butts are alike, and the saddle that's going to be comfortable for me probably is not going to be comfortable for you, but that is why saddles are made to be interchangeable. Almost on any electric bike or traditional bicycle I have ridden, the saddle comes off easily and you can buy a new one that fits you a little bit better and put it on the bike. This is how it's always been done. I've never bought a bike that I couldn't change the saddle on. This one, you can't change that saddle. If you buy the Honbike, you are committing to its 5-wood there that supports your butt. Now for me, that saddle was not very comfortable. It is fairly flat. It's got a nice density of foam, so it's cushy, but it has these 3 little slits in it. And for me, and how my sit bones are shaped, or those bones on the bottom of your pelvis that support the majority of your body weight on the bike, I ended up falling into one of those slits with one of my sit bones, and the other one was sitting on top of the foam. So I was a little bit cockeyed on the bike. Not the most comfortable position, and it did lead to a little bit of butt numbness for me. Noses on saddles also serve a very important thing. On a bicycle, you do this. You lean forward, and that weight has to be supported by something. And that's what the nose of the saddle does. It serves as just kind of this thing to support your body weight as your center of gravity shifts forward. And if you remove that, you just kind of fall forward on the bike. You're kind of continuously sliding forward on the saddle. That's what I noticed. I was continuously scooching back, and it actually caused me to put quite a lot of pressure on my hands on the handlebars. Obviously, saddles it's a weird sticking point. It's definitely a weird thing for me to be talking about in this length in the review, but you can't take that saddle off the Honbike. It's there. And the seat post can't be interchanged. You can't fix that. You can't change that. So if you're buying a Honbike, the saddle is what you get. The brakes are obviously a very unique thing, and another thing in the category of, I don't know if they needed a redesign, but in this case, they work just fine. I kind of like the additional comfort of the, you can kind of move your palms to the outside of them, use them as little bullhorn style grips, however you want to use them, and they work just fine. They didn't affect the performance of the bike at all. And moving on from those contact points, the bike's handling is actually fairly good. It's the traditional electric folding bike. It's rolling on 20-inch wheels, which are smaller. Gives the bike a relatively quick handling, but it's still very stable. It's very predictable, and it handles nicely through corners. There's a couple of other unique features that do affect its handling and ride quality, including the single-sided front fork, that single-sided drive shaft swing arm. There's no chain stays or seat stays. It's just a drive shaft that connects the rear end of the bike to the rest of it. And then you've got these cast magnesium wheels. All of those things add together and you even add in the fact that this is a folding bike, which is essentially just a bike that's been cut in half and then welded back together with a hinge, this thing is very, very flexy. When I would hit a drainage culvert or when I would go through a corner, I could feel the wheels and the front end of the back of the bike moving independently. It never got to the point where I felt like I was out of control, never felt dangerous, but it is something that I think the average person is going to notice. Obviously, it's my job to review bikes. I'm really hypercritical about how they ride, but it was to a degree that I think even, someone who's just ridden a bike like a normal person with normal person's experience on a bike is going to be able to feel it. It's just a little bit of an odd sensation. Overall, though, I think the Honbike is safe. I think it's going to be comfortable maybe for some people. I think some people are going to be really into the 5-wood style bike seat, but for me, it's probably not my cup of tea. So obviously, one of the greatest yardsticks you can use to tell how an e-bike is going to actually perform in the real world is to put it to the test on a hill. Now we're going to do this with the Honbike. We have our test hill hellhole that's a 12% gradient. It's a 1/3 of a mile long. It's a very big and steep hill, and it puts much more powerful e-bikes than this one all the way to their limit. All right, so this is the PAS 5 hill test for the Honbike HF01. It's got a 250 watt front hub motor. And most notably, it's going to be using 2 different sensors to help it up this hill. The first is a torque sensor, so measuring how hard I'm pedaling. And the second is a gyroscope, which in theory is going to be able to tell the bike it's going uphill and needs to give a little more effort. But I'm already getting to the point where I'm very confident this thing is not going to make it more than a few more feet. And there it goes. Yep, that's as far as it went. So obviously hellhole was a little bit much for the Honbike. Now before we chalk this up full bore to just not a very good hill climber, let's add some context as to why maybe it wouldn't have done well on hellhole in the first place. This is a small electric folding bike. It's got a small front hub motor and it even has a fairly small battery. This is not an e-bike that is designed for hill climbing. This is an e-bike for commuting in dense urban environments. You usually don't find 12% hills, let alone hills a 1/3 of a mile long in most city centers. San Francisco may be the obvious exception to that rule, but this bike is designed for flatland. It's designed for short commuting. It's designed for zipping in and out of traffic. You're not going to be very often putting this thing to the test on a really steep hill. So before you just flat out say it's not a good hill climber, I don't know if it was ever designed to do a hill like hellhole in the first place, so a little bit of credit to it there. A couple of notes on how it actually performed on hellhole. One, it didn't make it very far. It very quickly petered out in power. And then I don't know if you could hear it in that GoPro footage, but there is, for me at least as the rider, a very audible knocking noise as I'm pedaling. And I can even feel it through the pedals into my legs. I don't know what that knocking noise is. It really became prevalent any time that I would put more than, I would say, a soft pedal amount of force into the drivetrain. It feels to me a little bit like there's something inside the mechanical gears of that drive shaft that are actually slipping. I don't know what that means for the actual durability of the bike, for the bike's 40,000 kilometer claim of that drivetrain actually lasting, but that's to be determined. Overall, it did not clear hellhole, so probably not the bike you want to take on any steep hills. To me, in many ways, the Honbike feels like an experimental e-bike. It's a proof of concept that e-bikes of the future can and will be built around technology that was pioneered in the automotive and motorcycle industries. The centerpiece of all of this for the Honbike is its drive shaft, which is a very clear solution for the durability issues and even some of the cleanliness and maintenance issues that we see of traditional bicycle drivetrains. There's no chain to lube, there's no exposed componentry to rub pant legs on or to catch on a curb and tear off. It's all encapsulated in that nice little drive shaft. But It's not perfect. We did notice a knocking and maybe even a slipping, mechanical slipping noise when there was a lot of force put through that drivetrain. It also doesn't have gears. I don't know of a production status drive shaft bicycle drivetrain that has been produced yet. I know of at least one that's getting close, and I may be misspeaking. It may actually be for sale now, but this one is not there yet. In my opinion, the Honbike HF01 is an e-bike that's attempting to be ahead of its time. It's a harbinger of tech and design that's still to come. But as a real world functioning e-bike now in the present, if you were to buy this right now, I'm not sure the design is quite shaked out, at least not yet. If you've liked this review of the Honbike HF01, be sure to like and subscribe to electricbikereport.com. And if you want to know more about this e-bike and the testing that we put it through and the data we collected on it, be sure to click the link in the description below this video for a full detailed written review. For Electric Bike Report, I'm Sam Gross. Thank you so much for watching.